Can you really heal shame? Is it possible that I have been wrong about this over all these years? Let's talk about it. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. I recently had a conversation, one of many that I have over the years, talking about shame. And because it inevitably is going to come up, because it's something that we all experience, and it's important to be able to work through that as part of your healing. But something that I recognize is that while I have used the term heal shame, it's never felt quite right to me. I've never really liked it. It didn't seem to really fit with the reality, and I couldn't necessarily name why. It just never quite seemed to be an accurate representation. And recently, in a conversation, as I was kind of talking about releasing shame and that sort of thing, I recognized that healing shame, when I think of that, when I say that out loud, particularly in the context of healing trauma and all that that encompasses, to me, it has felt a little bit inaccurate or not a full representation, because it suggests that, like, if you have a wound and you heal it, you're still kind of carrying that with you, even if it's completely healed over. But like, if you have a huge gash in your arm and it heals, the wound, while it may not hurt, it may not affect you at all, maybe there's not even much of a scar, that wound is still kind of a part, right? Like, there may even be some body memory around it. There might be some pain, some sensitivity around it, but that's something that you carry throughout your life, even when it is healed. And I recognize that, like, I don't really know how to phrase what happens through the healing process with shame, what it is that's what we're actually doing when it comes to being able to release the shame. And I think releasing the shame um, is pretty accurate, but it also just didn't quite feel like it fully encompassed the reality of it. And maybe part of that is because I am, I think often in images, and it just never quite fully represented it, I didn't think. And so I recognize that for the kind of, maybe for the first time, really, just how disconnected I feel from the idea of healing shame, and how releasing shame just didn't quite seem to encapsulate. So obviously I kept thinking about it, because I get a little obsessive or hyperfixated on things like that, because I'm trying to make sense out of it. And I thought about how, in conversations that we've had here and conversations that I've had with people over the years, that I have kind of gone back and forth in talking about it, and really focusing on what it means to be able to release the shame, what that looks like in terms of healing. And when you still have shame, whether you're consciously aware of what all that shame is, or you're really not, and maybe even think that you don't have any, it can be incredibly difficult. And there's a reason for that. I would even say sometimes somewhat impossible to be able to really have a sense of life without shame. And I say that based on the experience that I've had with people over the years, and just things that people have shared with me. But I also think back to my own experience. And earlier on in my life, when I was filled with shame, the idea that there would come a time in which I no longer felt it, where I no longer believed the things that it reinforced, when I could have embarrassing moments and not feel filled with shame, because it wasn't yet something that I had experienced on an emotional or a physiological level, it would have seemed so foreign, so impossible. And I think that that's part of the challenge with shame, among some other things around this healing journey. But because shame is so impactful and it creates this incredible physiological response within us, whether we're aware that we're feeling shame or not, and it really can drive behavior. Feeling certainly, but that feeling then drives the behavior, and the behavior is often something that creates even more difficulty for us in some way. And so as I thought about this a little bit more, I had this different analogy that came to mind. Again, visually kind of thinking about it. So I don't believe that I'm wrong in regards to being able to heal and therefore not feel shame anymore. And the way that I thought about it, the kind of image that came to mind, and I'm sharing this with you because it may be helpful, particularly if you're a visual person. But even without that, it may be a helpful way to consider the healing process generally, but also certainly when it comes to shame and releasing shame. And one way to think about this in regards to healing generally is I often say how healing isn't about changing who you are or having to become somebody different. It's releasing everything that has made you believe falsehoods about who you are, right? It's about releasing it, and then the real you can be expressed. So the image that came to mind, or the idea that came to mind, is a snake shedding its skin. Now, I know that might freak some of you out, but if you think about that, right, it's this exterior thing that, when it comes to healing and shame, that what is left after that shedding is still what that thing is, right? So hopefully the idea of snakes isn't really upsetting anybody. But that being inside of that skin that it just shed, it's the same being, right? But through that process, it is able to completely shed all that stuff that is no longer needed. And when it comes to shame, you're not changing anything about who you are. You're not having to do anything specific to improve something about who you are. But through the healing process, through the growth process, you naturally, you have to work at it, but you naturally start shedding these layers of false beliefs and shame and fear and all of that stuff. So that what emerges from that is the truth of who you are. It's your wholeness that's always been there. So yes, absolutely, we can release and shed all the shame that we have carried around throughout our lives. And I know that can seem impossible. And part of the reason it can seem impossible, because you feel like, sometimes you might feel like you've done some really great work releasing shame on something. And then something can happen unrelated to maybe that shame, but shame is still triggered. And so therefore it feels like what the work that you've done and the improvements that you thought you made really didn't happen at all. But the thing that is important to remember about shame is that, very much like grief, we do not compartmentalize shame. We don't, our bodies, our physiological responses, and our beliefs do not compartmentalize. I have shame around this. I have shame around this, and I have shame around this, and I have shame around this. And when we're working on releasing that shame and shedding that shame, we're not working, or we're not shedding shame specific to one thing. We may be focused on one thing, but when we start to shed that, it works across. Just like when some aspect of shame is triggered, it brings up all shame. So the connection to grief that I mentioned is that grief works very much the same way because it's an emotional response. And our body doesn't know the difference between grief around somebody dying and grief around setting a boundary with somebody, or grief around giving up on a dream. Grief feels like grief, right? And so you feel grief around something, and then all the other things that you might be grieving can tend to come to the surface, even if subconsciously. So shame is very much the same in that regard, that if shame is triggered in any capacity, what the shame that we feel is shame as a whole. We may find ourselves thinking about lots of things that we feel shame around. We may be focused on just that one thing that triggered it, or depending on where we're at, we may not recognize that it is shame at all. So anytime that you're working on shedding shame in one area, particularly if you're doing it kind of mindfully, like being aware that you're doing that, it begins the shedding process in all those other places that you feel shame as well. And in case you haven't seen me or heard me talk about this before, we don't have to specifically work on every area of shame in our lives in order to be able to shed all the shame. However, if you are just focusing on one specific thing and you're not consciously aware of how the shame is all interconnected, and that the physiological response is very much the same, and that you can think about this thing and it can bring up this thing over here, if you're not aware of that, if that's not in your consciousness, then it's not going to work as well as what I was describing, where you work on one thing and it starts the shedding process of everything. So the more conscious you are about that, the more benefit there is in that way. So as you start to work on shedding shame, the response that you have to it begins to shift as well about these other things, because as you're working on shedding that shame, you're helping to change, to dismantle and deprogram those false beliefs so that you can be open to allowing yourself to trust in the truth of who you are. And as we are deliberately working on that in one area, again, if we're consciously aware, it can start to work on other areas as well. So I know that, again, it can seem impossible to really have any sense of how that can be real, especially if you find that you do have things that bring up shame quite often, or if it feels like you've done a lot of work around shame and you haven't gotten to where you want to be yet. And part of the challenge with that is, if you have done some work, is being able to trust that you will get there, but also, are you able to be as open and honest first and foremost with yourself, and then potentially with somebody else about the thing that you feel shame around? Because part of what happens often, and I've had this happen in my work, is that sometimes people will share a piece of something, and we'll talk about it, and we'll be able to talk about some things that help them recognize that, okay, maybe that isn't something that I need to feel ashamed of. However, if that was just a tiny piece of it and there's a whole lot more about that they feel shame around, and they didn't talk about it, even if that conversation went really well and they are feeling better about this one little piece, what often happens is that it can reinforce, well, they just know about this. Okay, I told her this and she was okay with that. She didn't seem too bothered by that. But if I told her all the rest of it, that's when she would think that I should be ashamed. And we've been able to have those kinds of conversations. I know that that is the reality, in part probably because I've experienced that a little bit myself earlier in my life, but also as we continue to work and shame continues to come up, we eventually get to some of those other pieces. So again, just a little reminder that you don't necessarily have to talk about absolutely everything that you feel shame around, but the things that your mind continues to go back to reinforce those false beliefs, those are generally going to be some things that are important to be able to share with somebody that you feel very trusting in and supported by, that has shown you that they can be that person for you. So while you can refer to it in whatever way you want, whether it's healing or releasing or however, whatever word you might use, I do want you to recognize and understand that through this healing process and being able to shed that shame, it's gone. It is gone. It isn't a wound that is scarred over that is going to get bumped again, and all that shame is going to come back. And I can say that in part from my own experience. There was so much. I was filled with shame. And for the most part, I never thought of myself as being filled with shame. I think I might have had thoughts occasionally like, I'm so ashamed, maybe. I honestly, I don't remember having that specific thought. But whatever I may or may not have thought, I know that I was filled with shame about everything. I could find a way to feel ashamed about anything. And throughout my healing process, and as more time has gone on, I can honestly say that I do not feel shame around anything. There are things that I regret. There are things that I wish I could do over. There are things that like now in my current life, there are things that I can feel embarrassed about. And when you have shame, embarrassment and shame are almost always, if not 100%, always together, because it immediately creates shame. I can feel embarrassment now, and I do quite often. Well, maybe not quite often, but I can certainly feel embarrassed. But I don't feel shame. I can make a mistake, and I don't feel shame. I can feel regretful about something, and I don't feel shame. I can even feel guilty about something, but I don't feel shame. And that's why I think it's important to recognize that it isn't just a wound that heals. It is something we completely release. And it is such an important part of healing because the shame, it's always there under the surface, and there's so many different ways and things that can bring it to the surface again, and it always reinforces those core beliefs. So even when you've done a lot of work on core beliefs, if you haven't worked on the shame, if that shame is triggered for whatever reason, you're going to feel like you haven't done any healing. You're going to feel like it was a waste of time or some aspect of that. So the shame is a significant, incredibly important aspect of all healing when it comes to trauma. And it can, and it does happen. It does happen incrementally. It is something that ebbs and flows a little bit. Sometimes you're doing really well with it, and sometimes it's triggered a little bit more easily. And that has to do with vulnerability. We've talked about that before as well. So next time you find yourself feeling shame around something, try to remind yourself that it's not so much about having to figure out how you're going to heal that and how do you learn to live with that. It's really not about that. It's about continuing healing so that you naturally shed that layer and all those layers of shame that you've carried around. I'd love to hear from you. Share what came up for you in the comments. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. And maybe give this a thumbs up so other people can more easily find it, because anybody who's experienced childhood trauma, shame is a part of that struggle. Thanks so much for being here. I look forward to seeing you next time.